recorded. Joey, if you could hit the record button for me, thank you. Today's session will be discussing supporting underserved communities. My name is Abby Cohen, and I am the Assistant Director for Initiative Development and Processing at ODHE. I am joined today by my colleagues, Joey Dirico and Lisa Holstrom, as well as two panelists from Cleveland State University and Ohio State University. Dr. C.K. Kwai, our first panelist from Cleveland State University, is the Director of the Center for International Programs and Services. And our second panelist from The Ohio State University, Caroline Omoleski, who is a Program Officer for Sponsored Programs and Academic Liaison. Our panelists have created presentations that they are going to share, and then we will open up at the end for a Q&A. I am now going to hand this off to you, Dr. C.K. Kwai.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. And I will try to keep this brief because there's actually a lot of information. So very quickly, the information that I'm going to talk about, it's really from my own personal experience of working in different institutions, private, public, and also at a system office actually. So for international transfer students. So the way I kind of always group this is that these are kind of key factors or questions that I tend to ask myself when I'm working with international transfer students. And I will go into each of them with a little more detail. So like say the first question I always ask myself is what information is available, what is my institution internal processes, that's my institution have a clear policy, on international transfer students. And of course, I always say the white elephant, the big elephant in the room is always the transfer credits. And this is usually kind of one of the big issue of, that transfer student tends to face. So, so I'm going to go into what information is available and what I mean by that. So the next slide will. So here it's what I mean is basically a lot of times what information we are putting out, right? And whether it's on our website, printed materials, or even very often, when we get a phone call from someone asking about transfer, do you accept transfer? What's the process? What's the procedure? And so what information is available, or we want to make it available? And how detailed more than anything else. And as I go to the next slide, I will come back to what I mean by some of this, right? So then the next question I tend to ask myself is, what is your institution, what my institution internal process is, right? So here is which department or which division handles the inquiry. And so that may lead back to where I would put the inquiry information, whether it's on a website or if it's through a phone call kind of a response. Application-wise, right? Who handles the application? Is it the admission office or is the international office in this sense? Of course, and then of course the admission decision. So then this will also help me to kind of decide where I would put, say, information on the website. Whether do I park it in admission? Do I park it in the international student page? Where do I put, where do I make the information available? Then, of course, like I said earlier, the million-dollar question is always the transfer credits, and I'll come back to that. And another important thing for international transfer students often is I-20. They are very anxious. They want the I-20. And so when a transfer I-20 issue, so legally, the regulation basically states that the new school only needs to issue the new I-20 as long as, well, actually backtrack and say that they can issue the new I-20 within 30 days from the first day of class. So, but this is again not something that most students are aware, right? So they keep asking, where's my I-20? Where's my I-20? So again, going back to what information, so do you actually disclose that information ahead of time in your website? Or, do you basically manage this or orientation when and what, how detailed, how much information you want to disclose, right? Then of course, where to direct other related immigration question. Then next, so this will all tie to the next part here, is that then does your institution have a clear policy on international transfer students? So this is something that I always say, there's no perfect plan or policy out there, and there's no magic bullet. Most institution is not able to have a truly complete, comprehensive policy because of limited resources. We cannot do it all. And sometimes it's also because you don't have the human resource or the expertise that can handle it. And that usually relates to the credential evaluation part, right? So, but along this line is really who sets the policy. It's really all the stakeholders involved in setting the policy. So this is something that to me is very, very important, because this helps to also then now go back to in terms of the in terms of your internal process, right? Who handles what, and everybody that involves needs to be part of setting the policy, because it involves, if it involves 3 different departments, 3 different divisions, then everybody needs to be on board. And then, the key here is how comprehensive is your policy. So here I'm giving kind of a couple of examples here. So does your policy include, US 2-year colleges to 4-year, US 4 years institution to 4-year institution? Does it include outside US 2-year colleges to 4-year institution, so on and so forth, right? I mean, there's all kinds of combination. You can also have transfer student coming in from an undergrad into a grad program. In general, higher education, we don't consider that as a transfer, but for international students, often is considered a transfer because they transfer the CBIS ID. And there is a different process with that. So again, how comprehensive, right? Then this will be a good segue to the last part that I'm going to talk about is credit. I'm just going to go back one thing because I want to make reference. So the types of credit. So does your policy include how what type of credits you accept, right? So the general, very quick, simple that a lot of times we see is the GCSE. This is the British equivalency to high school, all A levels, and this is a step above the high school. So how do we deal with it? And then the less common are the BTEC and the CXC. If you don't know what they are, because they are less common. The BTEC is still a British curriculum or British credential, but the CXC is actually Caribbean. So the CXC is equivalent to a high school, but little caveats. It sometimes can be compared to similar to the A levels, but again, some examples of how comprehensive your policy is when it comes to credits. And then the last part here on credit transfer, the next slide. And this is, like I say, a portion that students are very, very interested in, but very often most institutions is not able to have a very comprehensive policy or practice is because of experience and expertise and also resources to be able to do that, right? So the easy part, of course, is US credits. So if they're coming from a US institution to another US institution, then that is pretty straightforward. That's quite easy to deal with. The difficult part, of course, is that if someone coming from California to Ohio, well, California has a very different general education system, so that can be a little tricky. But in general, it's pretty easy to convert those credits. International or foreign credits is a little difficult because, again, based on experience of how you're going to deal with it, and then of course who evaluates and whether you have what I call sometimes a blanket policy or syllabus by syllabus or syllabi by syllabi, right? I mean, it depends on institutional policy and expertise of how you deal with it. A classic example here, is if you have a foreign language requirement, then you may have a heritage speaker that don't necessarily write well or read well, but speaks fluently. And so now, how do you evaluate that? So that's kind of where, you may look at, for someone that has a blanket policy, they may say, okay, it's fine. They are native speakers, so they are going to they will waive the foreign language requirement. But if you tend to have more of a syllabus by syllabi kind of a evaluation, then there's no syllabi here. There's no syllabus for you to evaluate. So therefore, you may not be able to do that. So that's some of the like I say, key factors that I always use when I work with international students. But again, like I say, most institution is not gonna be able to have a very comprehensive. It's because we all have limited resources, and we have limited expertise in terms of evaluation. So I will kind of stop there and move on.
Yes, thank you, Dr. C.K. Kwai. Thank you for your insight on this. I am now going to hand over the presentation to Caroline. Caroline, if
Sure.
you're able to share your screen.
Sounds good. Let's see. It's taking a moment to share.
Okay, take your time. If you're unable to share, we can have Joey prop up the presentation for you.
Yeah, maybe that might be better. It's just spinning and having trouble connecting. So maybe if you are able to pull up my slides, that might be easier. Thank you. Alrighty. So yes, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. My name is Caroline Omaleski. I'm from the Office of International Affairs at Ohio State. I work on our global engagement team at OSU, and I wear a lot of different hats in the office, but part of what I focus on involves supporting students who are struggling academically and are in other types of crises. So that angle of my work kind of informs some of this presentation today. So if you want to go to the next slide. So I always like to start off any presentation about international students just kind of by clarifying who exactly we're talking about with that. So on the next slide, you'll see that really, who we are discussing, and I think this is mainly who our previous presenter was talking about as well, are students who are here on a student visa type in F1 or J1 status. So these are students whose legal status in the US is dependent on their full-time enrollment, which I think is important for a variety of reasons. There are lots of other students on our campuses who could be considered international, but aren't subject to the same types of regulations, so don't have the same types of restrictions. Students like permanent residents or dependents of a spouse who's here on a work visa, or refugees, all kinds of different categories. But mainly who I work with are those F1 and J1 students on a student visa. So for the next slide, just to give you a quick sense for the numbers that we're looking at right now, in the US total, we are back up over 1 million international students. And here in Ohio, we are ranked 9th in terms of largest international student body with about almost 37,000 students studying in Ohio specifically. So in terms of where they come from, if you go to the next slide, this is nationally, and here at OSU, we track pretty closely with this, although our China bubble would be a little bit bigger than our India bubble. But, we have students really coming from all over the world, but places like East Asia are very well represented. Places like Canada, Brazil also send a strong number of students. So that's kind of what those statistics look like. So I wanted to mention a couple basic immigration requirements because I think that these are important for understanding just the experience of what it's like to be an international student in the US. These immigration requirements can have implications for just kind of the stress level that students are under in terms of having to maintain status. So just kind of so everyone's on the same page, all F1 and J1 students in the US, really the most important thing is that they have to enroll full-time every semester. They have a lot less flexibility with dropping classes if they're not doing well in a certain class or various other reasons. They always have to keep their address up to date. The government always wants to know where our students are living. And then another big one is that students have to follow restrictions on employment. So an international student can't just go down the street and get a job at any employer anytime to earn some extra money. There's very strict guidelines on what type of employment they can hold. So I think the implication of all of that is that they have a lot less flexibility in the options available to them when it comes to enrollment, when it comes to their finances, and just kind of the general mental stress and pressure associated with making sure that they're staying on the right side of those regulations. So on the next slide, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about what I see as being some kind of key features of international students' adjustment to life in the US. I think often there's kind of an expectation on our part that our international students will adapt to life in the US. And I like to kind of look at that through the lens of, the social and academic skills that international students have developed over the course of their education, over the course of their life. Those might have been culturally relevant to them in their home country's environment, but maybe suddenly they don't feel as relevant here. So oftentimes students feel like they have to kind of relearn how to study, relearn how to make friends, because those skills that they had from home may not be working for them anymore. But in addition to this being kind of all on the student to figure out, I think that schools really have a kind of a duty to provide some opportunities for international students to learn about academic and cultural expectations here in the US and kind of get some guidance on what their adaptation process will look like. So that can happen at new student orientation, through workshops that you might offer for students throughout the year, and also through just things like social events and opportunities to interact with domestic students. So I would kind of break down the areas of adjustment into these categories, and I'll kind of go through them one by one. But certainly academic, our students, they're here to be full-time students. That's really often their priority, but they're not just adjusting academically, they're also adjusting to using a new language, to fitting in socially, to figuring out societal norms, that kind of thing. And there's also kind of always this process of figuring out what things are really like here versus maybe what they had expected from home, from whether it was watching TV shows or reading things online or talking to friends who had been to the US before, things like that. So we will start with the academic, if we can go to the next slide. So I'm gonna, for this one, kind of be referencing a needs assessment survey that we did here at Ohio State last spring. And there was a lot of interesting data that came out of that survey. Basically, we asked students about their academic experience in terms of areas where they had confidence versus areas where they felt challenged. And we kind of compared new students with continuing students. And I'll just highlight a couple things from that needs assessment survey. New students reported lacking the most confidence in things like giving presentations in class and participating aloud in class and writing papers. I don't think that's surprising to anyone. That's one of the kind of scariest things to do, is to stand up in front of people and speak, and writing is an area where they reported needing some extra support. And then for continuing students, that looked more like, still continuing to adjust to using English, understanding assignment expectations, and again, that class participation piece was still in there. Another thing that I thought was interesting from this survey was that a lot of students, and we were looking at both some qualitative and quantitative data for this. So in a lot of the comments that students wrote, they would mention, feeling confident about things like group work, but really feeling challenged by what they saw as the individualistic nature of US academics. Students tend to study by themselves rather than in groups. They tend to, obviously do all their own work because that's the expectation here, whereas where they were coming from often, students just worked together a lot more. So that tended to be an area of adjustment. And then, of course, I'm sure it's no surprise that, confidence with English strongly correlates with confidence in a lot of different academic tasks. And we'll talk more about English in a minute. But in terms of, how can schools help with this adjustment? I think, I'll mention orientation a few times, but I think having strong orientation materials and programs that really set the expectations of what, life is really like in the US classroom. I gave some examples of some of the workshops that we offer during our orientation, like academic success in a new cultural environment. I think it's helpful to kind of guide students through thinking about some of the ways that their experiences here might be different. We also have an academic success course that is specific to international students, which has been really successful. So if it's within your university's bandwidth to offer something like that, it can be really helpful. I think it's also really important to support faculty in their teaching of international students, so that if they're having challenges with that population, they feel like they know kind of what strategies they can use and that kind of thing. On the next slide, so linguistic adjustment is another big area. Comfort with English really is essential for all types of success in a student's life here. It doesn't mean that the goal is for them to achieve near native proficiency, but making progress and becoming increasingly comfortable with English really is important. And we're finding that, especially with the rise of things like generative AI tools, though, because students are becoming very reliant on those types of tools, they're practicing their English a little bit less maybe than they were 5 or 10 years ago. So we're kind of learning how to work with students on that. But in terms of ways that schools can really help students with this type of adjustment, offering something like an English conversation program and other types of social activities that encourage interaction between international and domestic students, encouraging students to join student orgs where they can practice English. And also, I think it's really important for faculty and staff to give positive feedback to students when they do speak up in class or when they do approach you with a question. Students really feel much more confident when they know that they're understood and when they feel like they're really getting through. So I think that's important. All right. So the next slide for social adjustment. So another thing that really came through pretty strongly in the needs assessment survey that we did was that students felt like their social or emotional or cultural adjustment was a much more difficult process than the academic adjustment. Most students felt pretty confident in most academic tasks after a couple of semesters, but there were still big challenges for them feeling like they fit in here, culturally or socially. The biggest challenge that students reported by far was making friends with American students. That is a desire on the part of a lot of international students, but they just have a hard time making that happen. So I think it's really important for schools to provide sort of intentional opportunities for those two groups to interact. And we were also sort of a little disheartened to see that 30% of our students said it was challenging or very challenging for them to feel like they belong on campus and they don't necessarily feel at home on campus. So that's something that we really want to try to work on, and also just hear from students, what would make you feel more at home. I think it's important to kind of get students' voice in that process. But in terms of providing opportunities for students to have that meaningful interaction between domestic and international populations, a couple examples of our office's programs are shown there, but I would definitely encourage any school to think about ways that they can bring those two groups together. And then for the cultural adjustment, I always like to show this image of the iceberg. You've probably seen it before, but I think it's a pretty good analogy. The idea here is that in the tip of the iceberg, the part that's visible, there's kind of all these fun parts of culture, the types of things that we tend to celebrate in our office's programs, like food, dress, music, holidays, language, those kind of things that you can easily build an event around. But culture is so much more than just those things. There's also this whole invisible part of culture that's below the surface, so to speak, that might involve a lot of the things that you see there. I know it's a little bit small, but things like how you solve problems, body language, personal space, all those kind of things. And I think we've tried to develop some programs that really encourage students to explore those deep culture concepts and how they've shaped who they are in terms of their own cultural identity. And I always like to kind of encourage American students, or whether it's faculty or staff, kind of to examine what our own quote unquote normal is for some of those things, and think about how maybe that's not universal across the world. And if we're having some kind of communication difficulty with an international student, or if there's some kind of conflict, maybe the reason for that is because of kind of a mismatch on some of those deep culture concepts. So in terms of, my topic here was holistic support for international students. So what does that really look like? And I mentioned earlier that I work with students who are kind of in crisis of various kinds, whether it's academic or other issues. And, most of the students that I see really need support managing what I would call life issues above and beyond more academic concerns. A lot of students will wind up in my office because they're placed on academic probation. But when I speak with them, really the main issue is a mental health problem that they're having, or maybe they had a death in the family, or maybe they're under a lot of financial stress. It's not that they can't be a good student if all the other pieces align, but really what they need support with is often getting referrals to places like counseling and consultation service, or our student advocacy office, or the wellness center, or lots of other resources. And sometimes supporting a student academically really is going to come in the form of helping them kind of get their personal issues, supported. So if that means walking them over to the student health center, or helping them even plan to take some time off from school if they're just not in a place where they can, be a full-time student right now, helping a student academically can look a lot of different ways. And I think another important thing is that a lot of international students will start utilizing non-academic campus resources when they see what value it could provide them in terms of their academic goals. So if they know that they need to sort out, the mental health issue that they have, if they're going to be able to concentrate on class, that can be a good motivator for them. I also think, and I think I mentioned this earlier, I think it's really, really important also to support students by supporting the faculty and staff who are working with them and teaching them. One way that we try to do that at Ohio State is offering what we call the International Student Experience Workshop Series. I actually was just running straight from one of those to come here. And we try to kind of cover an international student's full experience chronologically over the course of the series. And really the goal is to educate faculty and staff about what is it really like to be an international student on our campus, kind of, develop some empathy towards that population. We always have a panel of international students who speak as a part of each one of those workshops, so that the attendees can hear directly from them about what it's like being in their shoes. So if it's within your bandwidth to develop something like that, I think for us it's been really, really impactful. Just a couple barriers I would mention to accessing resources. We have so many resources available at Ohio State. It's what's great about working at a large university. However, a lot of them tend to be underutilized because students either just don't know about them or don't feel comfortable going there. Sometimes I think we also have to realize that the concept of, fill in the blank center, whether it's a wellness center, counseling consultation service, or student health insurance office, there may not be the equivalent of that at the university that they came from, or, in their home country. So kind of just making sure that everyone's on the same page about what these offices actually offer and who they're for. I think some of the student hesitations that I hear from students are the ones, down there. I think students are wondering, like, is this really for a student like me? If I go there, am I going to see other students who look like me, who sound like me? Will they really understand my point of view? And then again, that issue of, is this really going to help me get my GPA back on track, or what have you? So those are things that might need to be addressed if you're really going to connect students successfully with resources. So just kind of to wrap up, how can you help welcome new students to your campus and help them adjust? I think certainly for a big school like ours, it's a big part of it is just putting kind of a personal face on a large place. Even if you're at a small school, I think there's still an element of kind of giving someone a personal connection, showing some patience and empathy, helping them navigate your campus, but not just the physical campus, but also kind of your school's bureaucracy. We have plenty of bureaucracy here at OSU, and you know, helping students understand what does it mean when we say go to the bursar. What is a bursar? They may not be familiar with that term or whatever other terminology you're using. So, you know, I think it's important for everyone to just kind of put themselves in the place of a new student who's coming from across the world at a, you know, early in their education, thinking about how overwhelming that might seem, but also how exciting it might seem. So, so yeah, those are kind of my general guidance on holistic support for international students. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for your input. We are going to open up now to a Q&A. I did want to start off and ask you both a question. I know you both shared the challenges, but what, in your opinion, are some of the biggest challenges that you guys face when dealing with international students? Caroline, I know you said it's very important to support their mental health, especially those that are coming into your office. They're coming into your office for a specific reason. I was wondering for you, Dr. Kwai, if you have any specific challenges when facing international students.
Well, of course, like what Caroline mentioned, right? I mean, culturally, it's always one of those big, challenges that they face, and that tends to take a longer time. But academic, from the standpoint of the students coming from a very different education system and having to kind of unlearn what they have learned in the past, 18, 20 years, and relearn a different approach, a different way of studying, different way of handling assignments. So, for example, we do a workshop on plagiarism because the definition of plagiarism is very different, from country to country, right? So a lot of times students genuinely are not, intentionally cheat, but that's because they don't understand what we mean by plagiarism. So, I take the example of, the British system because I study abroad in England, right? And so, I mean, the system is, if someone asks you for the definition, you are to produce verbatim the definition that's in the textbook. That is what is expected, right? So, but of course, when students do that here, I mean, then that it will be considered as plagiarism. And so a lot of times, like I say, it's not intentional, but they just need to kind of unlearn what they know, from before, and then relearn the new approach. So that is definitely one of a huge challenge for a lot of students.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to generalize because, and I think that's part of the challenge that we have international students coming from, over 100 different countries, and all their past experiences might be a little bit different. So, when you kind of figure out, this is how things look for maybe Chinese students, which is a large population that we have. Well, maybe when you have someone coming from somewhere different, they might need a different type of support. So kind of navigating that can be a challenge. But yeah, I definitely think kind of the cultural piece and maybe kind of a mismatch in expectations or understanding might be one of the bigger ones.
Great, thank you for that. We have a question in the chat. It says, can you please discuss what financial supports exist for international community college transfer students who do not qualify for federal financial aid, such as DACA, undocumented, or refugee students?
I'm going to jump in here. Excellent question. It's difficult. It's very difficult because, they're not eligible for any federal aid. I guess we are very fortunate at CSU, at Cleveland State. We do have a private donor, the Hujas that has set up a Huja Endowment Scholarship. So that is open to international student. So, but again, past experience working at different institutions, a lot of times the financial aid for international students will come from private donors. Or if it's a private institution, then of course again, right? I mean, so the endowment from the private institution. So they are almost always kind of some form of a private funded, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to community colleges specifically, but I know at OSU it's very, very difficult. There's almost no financial aid available at the undergraduate level for international students. We do have one small emergency grant for students who have true emergency situations, unexpected medical expenses, things like that. But there really is no other financial aid available for international students, which is always a really difficult conversation to have for students who find themselves in unexpected, financial problems. But that's kind of the reality of the situation because they're not eligible for most, federal money.
Thank you for that. I did have a separate question for CSU, and that is for Cleveland State University. My apologies. How were you able to determine and then gather all the stakeholders to have a conversation about policy?
So one way is to kind of what Caroline briefly mentioned earlier at one point too, right? You kind of step yourself, you put yourself into the shoe of an international student, and you kind of think, what do I do? What do I do first? And then you figure out which department deals with that. So for example, right, if I am an international student and I want to transfer from say Cleveland State to Ohio State, right? So I want to know, what do I do? What's the first thing that I should do, right? So that will be probably searching something on the web, right? So then that takes to the first step of what information we would like to put on our website. And then of course, then where to put that information. And so kind of going down and then figure out which department, who deals with that part of it. And then, and then a lot of diplomacy and get people involved, reach out. Sometimes, of course, if you work, if you're able to work very closely with the vice provost or the VP vice president of those areas, then you can kind of get them to corral, right, the departments to work together. So, for example, I sit down with our VP of Enrollment Management and work out, right, because our financial aid comes under them, and also a registrar, so on and so forth, and then I kind of decide who needs to be at that particular meeting where we have to sit down and kind of map it out, in terms of what information and where to provide those information.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Kwai. I think we are going to do one more question because we are getting towards the end of our time here. And this one was directed to you, Caroline. It says, when you host workshops, what is your attendance or compliance rate like? And do you require attendance, or is it just recommended to specific staff?
So for the workshops that we offer for students, those are all optional. When we offer them during our orientation period, the academic workshops, for instance, we do get decent attendance at those. I mean, we have, for our orientation for autumn, for instance, we have about 1,600 students coming in, and I would say each workshop we get somewhere between 10 to 30 students, depending on where it falls in the time frame. So attendance is good at that juncture in the semester. I would say if we try to offer workshops during the semester when students are busy in class with work and everything, it's really harder to get the attendance high. So we've kind of stopped offering them outside the orientation period. The workshops that we offer for faculty and staff, those tend to be pretty well attended because I think faculty and staff are pretty motivated to learn about this population. So we do get pretty strong attendance at those. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for your time today and your very insightful presentations. If you did not get a chance to ask a question, I think we are going to put Caroline's and Dr. Kwai's emails in the chat below, so you can follow up with them if you do have any extra questions. Before we go, I did just want to mention a couple of housekeeping items. I wanted to plug our Friends of OATN newsletter. It's a great way to stay up to date with OATN and to hear updates about future Transfer Talk Tuesdays if you found this interesting. Our next scheduled Transfer Talk Tuesday tentatively is for April 8th, so just a couple months from now. We also make this recording available in many places. We'll put it on our website, our YouTube page, and I think we also send it out in our Friends of OATN newsletter. So I just wanted to thank again, Caroline, Dr. Kwai, for your time today, and for all the attendees who took time out of your afternoon. Thank you. We will see you all next time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.